Alexander Keig. Our guest this hour is Dr. Trystan Cotton. Dr. Cotton is Professor of Gender Studies and Director of the Gender Studies Program in the Department of Sociology, Gender, and Gerontology at California State University at Stanislaus. Dr. Cotton's portfolio is expansive and includes 6 edited collections of scholarly criticism and narrative testimonies on a wide range of topics, such as the philosophies and aesthetics of women, of colors, art, and literature, intersectional migrations of trans subjectivity across multiple borders of geography, nationality, gender and sexuality, race, ethnicity, and class. The Oprah fixation of American culture, shifting sex and gender embodiments of trans surgical journeys. He has also published numerous articles on the shifting terrains of race, class, and gender privilege, disadvantage for trans people of color. He is currently working on a documentary film, A Road Less Traveled, about the complex and unique journeys of trans men of color. Dr. Cotton is the founder and managing editor of Transgress Press, an independent publisher that produces books on various trans, queer, and feminist issues. The press recognizes the need for disenfranchised people to build institutions that reflect their values and serve their communities. Transgress Press many books that are rejected by other presses because their profit margin projections are too small. Aside from sponsoring cultural and educational programming on LGBTQ issues, the press recycles profits back into trans, queer, and feminist communities through direct organizational donations, book drives, sponsoring conferences, community workshops, author readings, and signings. You can check out Dr. Cotton's website at www.transgresspress.org. Welcome to our show, Dr. Cotton.
Thanks so much, folks. It's a pleasure to be here. You can just go by Theo. That works for me. And I want to wish everybody a happy Juneteenth.
Yes, thank you. That's wonderful.
Thanks, Theo. Happy Juneteenth, everyone. I was trying to remember when it was that you and I met each other, and I'm thinking perhaps it was at the Gender Odyssey conference in maybe 2009 or 2011. I think 2010 was the year that they didn't have a conference. They skipped a year. And so did you come to the workshop that I led on either celebrating masculinity or the ups and downs of phalloplasty? Was that where we met?
Where we actually initially met, I believe. All of our memories are fading as we age. I remember you at Gender Odyssey, and I did attend those seminars because I was very much interested in surgery myself and in knowing more about the road that I was about to travel on. I was just beginning my transition in 2007. So I think where I actually first came into contact with you was when you were leading the groups, the Lou Sullivan Society. Do you remember that? Back in 2006 or so, you were doing those groups, and I attended the one. I was living in the Castro at the time, so it was just a short walk up the street to there's a medical center. It's up there if you keep going straight up 18th Street, and that's where they were being held. Do you remember that? But I don't think I really introduced myself to you. I was just sort of in and around the community and just kind of feeling my way out. So that was my first recollection, I believe.
Oh, but again, fantastic. Yeah, for people who are unfamiliar, the Lou Sullivan Society was started by, I think it was 5 of us, 5 trans guys in the city of San Francisco Bay Area, Greater Bay Area, in order to honor the life of Lou Sullivan, who passed away. He died in 1991 from AIDS. And those of us who started Lou Sullivan Society had been involved with FTM International, which Lou Sullivan started FTM San Francisco. And after his death, it was taken over by some other trans men, including Jameson Green, who was a guest on our show previously. He was the president or something akin to president of FTMI for a number of years. And that's when it became FTM International from FTM San Francisco. So that's fantastic. So that does predate, because that would have been around 2006, 2007, because I didn't get my surgery till 2008, bottom surgery. So we were reacquainted, thankfully, at Gender Odyssey. And that led us to talking about bottom surgery, about phalloplasty in particular, but also metoidioplasty. And for the project to begin on the book Hung Jury, right? So Hung Jury is an anthology of bottom surgery stories from trans men living and deceased. We were able to get some stories from other writings for these gentlemen, including Dr. Michael Dillon, who had his surgery in the 40s, and Lou Sullivan, who had his surgery in I believe the late 80s in San Francisco with Dr. Michael Brownstein, metoidioplasty. And so we were talking about doing a book, but where to publish it. And then Transgress Press came out of wanting to publish Hung Jury. So that's my recollection of the origins of Transgress Press. Now, Transgress Press has been around for a number of years now, has published several books. Many of them have been recognized for awards, and a handful of them have actually won awards, like Lambda Literary Awards. And so you want to tell us a little bit more about Transgress Press, and in your bio it mentioned trans and queer and feminist, but maybe give us some examples of a couple of books that maybe people really, really enjoy, and maybe tell us about a book or two that people might not be familiar with. Let's boost the awareness of some of the books at Transgress Press.
You got a hell of a memory for details and remembering intricacies. And so the interesting thing about that book is that my experiences in surgery and doing that book, that became for me a lifelong topic and issue of research for me in my own portfolio. And since that time, I've gone on to publish another book around that issue and several articles and done some research. And we could get into that later if time permits. But Hung Jury was the first book that Transgress Press published. And the press was founded in 2012. It took me about a year to do all the research to get it, to lay the groundwork and the foundations for it. And in 2013, I believe that was when Hung Jury came out, that January 2013. And that book subsequently funded probably the first 5 or 6 years of profits from that book I used to other book that came out early years. We needed a publisher. There were a lot of factors that were, for me, that were coming into play or that were percolating at that time. And one of those had to do with that type of book and considering who was going to publish that kind of book, since it's a very niche topic, its audience is very specific. So we thought we'd have problems. And then also, particularly around problems around A, finding a publisher, and B, working with a publisher that had our vision. When I say our, I mean all the people who wrote for that book, the people who hatched the ideas. I mean, when I say our, I mean all the workshop, including the ones that you did. You helped me get a lot of testimonies. So I mean that for people that sort of went into that, of making that possible. And so there were a number of factors that were going on. And one was to try to find a publisher that would allow us to have as much control over what we say as possible. And so there were other things too that was going on for me. I was also transitioning and becoming more visible, I think, and sort of vocal out. You yourself, I think, you and Jameson Green were kind of already sort of established as leaders in the community. And so for me, I think in some ways I was also looking at what ways could I contribute something to the community. And being an academic, I do work in trans theory and queer theory and feminist theory. This is when my intellectual development took place when I was in grad school. It's the area that I work in. And so I had recognized the need for self-empowerment and control over the literature that trans people published and wrote. And as an academic, I did not believe that academic literature sufficiently engaged with the issues and the identities of the masses of trans people. When I say the masses, I just mean anyone out there who identifies as gender nonconforming or trans. And so that literature, though, tends to focus on a very narrow range of topics of interest, mainly to academics. And one of the reasons for this is because many academics are positioned socially, economically, and politically in ways that don't expose them to the masses of lived struggles that people are dealing with every day. And related to this, with academics doing work on trans and gender nonconforming people, that that work tends to privilege queer and feminist frameworks of gender and sexuality in guiding the research. And that has led to a number of problems. It leads to the problem of trans people whose lives don't appear to fit easily or seamlessly into the queer or feminine framework. So their lives are not studied. Their lives tend to be marginalized. Their choices around gender, sexuality tends to be problematized and misrepresented under that trans umbrella. I also felt like a lot of the work that I, as an academic, was seeing in the academic discourse didn't really truly work with the intersectional model of analysis. So people would say, it's almost like a buzzwords now to sort of say, I do intersectionality work or I do race, class, and gender work. But then you would sort of read these analyses, and it was clear that the people, when they were posing the types of questions to answer and explore, came to the conclusions and analyzing and examining those things did not have much at all to do with the masses of people who are trans and gender nonconforming. And that's because in these frameworks, the analysis tends ultimately, even though people say they're doing it, it's still, at the end of the day, I find largely privileges an abstract subjectivity that is privileged in terms of race, class, socially educated. And so I know that is not how the masses or the majority of trans people live in this country or even around the world. And so it was really important, I think, to see those trends in academia and then to design a press that trans people could publish their work. And we have published a number of titles that are used in academic settings. It's important at that time to create an institution where trans people could have a lot more control over what they produce and could see themselves more accurately and appropriately, I think, represented in the literature that was being produced by them. And so one of the things I learned when I studied, there are two different traditions in African-American political theory. One is assimilationist, institutionalist, the other was sort of Black power. So I'll never forget about that Black empowerment political tradition in African-American thought. And that tradition says if a Black community is going to survive, it needs to build and maintain control over its institutions in its community. That seems to go without saying. It seems to be a given. But when oppressed and marginalized people try to go about doing that, it's an uphill climb because of the systemic oppression that closes down the opportunities and shuts down the possibilities for them. And so you can just take that lesson learned from African-American struggle in the country and apply that to trans people's struggles. And trans people need to have more control. We need to build institutions. We need to staff those institutions. We need for those institutions to carry us through this century and into the next, because it is an uphill battle. If you think it's nasty now, it's just going to get a whole lot worse with using trans people's lives as a political football. So those different factors coming into play that shape my thinking initially around what its mission should be and what it should do, how it should function. And I'll say this one thing and last thing, and then while I say you can talk about myself as a founder of this, and maybe I got this sort of idea, but the fact that the press came into existence and the fact that it has existed for more than 10 years now is nothing short of a village basically holding up this institution. And it's not been me. So I might have had the idea initially, but the way the foundation was laid, the way that it has progressed over time has very much been a community effort. And there are ways it went in directions that I wasn't necessarily thrilled about. You listen to the pulse beat of the people rather than your own. You asked me if I can keep talking, but you asked me about a couple of books. I can give you a couple. Most of our books center on trans and gender nonconforming life. Most of them are written by trans people, but not all of them are. So, for example, we have a book that was published by a gentleman, Rex Butt, and the name of that book is Now What? And it's a book for parents who are grappling with and struggling, trying to understand their children who are 4, 5, and 6 years old and saying, I don't feel like this is the body for me, or I want to play with these toys, or I want to wear these clothes. It's not a how-to manual, sort of how to go about gender transitioning for your child, but it is a manual that's aimed at and designed for parents to understand their children are going through, and very importantly, to facilitate familial communication in a positive way so that everyone can sort of grow into a future together and children can feel safe and parents can do this at a pace that they feel comfortable with their children being safe as well. Look, he's a cisgender man. He's also an academic. His daughter is trans. And so it was the combination of his own personal experience. And then, of course, him being an academic, he did all this research and communication studies that helped to sort of put this book together that helps parents navigate, particularly right now, a very thorny situation for their kids, particularly in the Midwestern and Southern states. So that's one example. We came out with a book last year called Black Canvas, A Campus Haunting. And that book is a historical novel, and it retells the origins of Dartmouth College existence and how that origin is steeped in anti-queer and anti-Native American and colonial narratives that sort of uphold whiteness and heterosexuality as normative models of citizenship. And so what this book does is it's very much at the center. They puts a non-binary African-American person who grows up in a very poor urban environment. It puts them at the center. So they've got all these issues. They're grappling with class issues, economic issues, bodily representation, bodily feeling, gender identity, sexuality, and also issues of matters of race and displacedness around race. And so what that book does is it, through the process, narrates it's a Gothic novel. So it's a horror novel. And it narrates this young non-binary person's first year at Dartmouth College and moving through the thorny thickets of gender, race, and sexuality. And what's amazing about this book is that as it tells this story of complexity around race, gender, and sexuality, it also digs up this history that we don't want to talk about, this history of Native American disenfranchisement, this history of slavery. You can see it in social legislation today, trying to ban books, certain types of books anyway. So almost all of our books have a social value or social commentary to them. And so that one's written by an African-American trans man who also happens to be an academic in feminist studies. I'll give you a title of a book that's not written by an academic, but someone who's still nonetheless operating very intellectually in the world. And this is a book I'm particularly proud of because it's not a book about trans people per se, but it does enfold and include LGBTQ issues in the book. But the book was written by a trans woman, actually. A trans woman who is a very brilliant woman and has an extensive military career and a career working in the Department of Defense and work as a social analyst, working in various sectors in our government, really around protecting our country and our nation from foreign terrorism. And so what she did was she wrote this book. The title of the book is called American Fascism, How the GOP is Subverting Democracy. And it's a really compelling analysis of not only sort of what we're facing today and how we got here to this situation where we're basically teeter-tottering between democracy and the impulses of a totalitarian, authoritarian existence in America. I think our democracy is hanging by a thread. I don't think and I could talk more about that if you want later, but I've spent many years, just as an aside, as fascism and totalitarian movements in the world and historically. And so that statement comes out of my analysis of America within that context. But what I found was particularly compelling about this book is by, her name is Bryn Tannehill, is that she's a trans person who's writing about a much larger sense of history. And what I liked about her work, unlike other scholars who've written on the subject of fascism and total totalitarianism, is that this young, transgender, well-educated, likely upper-class white woman takes the time to understand the histories of African Americans and to understand the role that race plays in the current movement to undo our democracy. And so I recognized it. When I read it, I couldn't put it down because again, like I was saying a little earlier, I have this background knowledge and research that I really don't talk a lot about, that I could tell right away that this was a compelling book because Bryn Tannehill was willing to deal with the narratives around race and that had gone back to 1860s that go all the way back to the Civil War.
We are going to take our first commercial break. We'll be back shortly.
UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good.
We are back from commercial break. Let's pick up where we left off.
Because Bryn Tannehill was willing to deal with the narratives around race and that had gone back to 1860s that go all the way back to the Civil War. I recognized it as a compelling analysis because I grew up in the South and I grew up with people angry that Black people were free. I grew up with people saying they were still fighting the Civil War. You niggas are not, you can edit it out if you want to. You niggas should have kept you in chains a long time ago. Y'all don't deserve it. I grew up with that. So I knew how deeply embedded and how far back that resentment went. It went back for generations and it hadn't necessarily gone away. And so what I thought was particularly brilliant about her book in comparison to all of the scholarship out there is she's not afraid to go there, whereas they won't address it at all. And that's why that book is, I'd call it a comprehensive analysis of our breakdown in society today in a way that I don't see with others. And so that book is not necessarily about trans topics, but it was written by a trans woman that we couldn't let another publisher have that book.
Interesting and consequential book. You could go on and on and on. I should break in here just briefly as a disclaimer. Probably should have said this earlier, but I am the co-editor of a book that's published by Transgress Press. It's called Manning Up. It's an anthology. It contains 27 different stories written by trans men, including Theo. You have a chapter in the book. So Mitch Kellaway and I are the co-editors of that book. So I just wanted people to know that I have a personal investment in the press.
Let me just say, you have always had a personal stake, even before that book and even after that book. And that's something I really appreciated about you and over the years, just how much you were a cheerleader for Transgress Press and for the work that we did. And I do want to mention Manning Up because it is one of our more popular academic books. It's taught in gender studies courses, and I've taught that as well. And so that's another book I'm really proud of because it's also at that time, and I think still to this day, it's one of the few books out there where trans men are writing about issues beyond transition and addressing issues around aging and fathering and just dealing with the day-to-day. Thank you, Zander.
Absolutely. It's been my pleasure. I will continue to be a cheerleader.
Where I live, it's a very tourist sector of the country. I don't know if you've been to St. Augustine, Theo.
I haven't, but I hear it's beautiful.
It is beautiful. And some years ago, when my partner's child was struggling with their identity, and since then they've now detransitioned and they're back to female pronouns and identity. But at the time, I'm going to refer to him in that time period. He was into the fire and police department and trying to fit in. She's recently joined the Navy. But there was some conversation at the fire department, and I was taking pictures and just listening in between their conversations because they were giving him at the time a tour. And one of the, I suppose, maybe leaders at the fire department had corrected someone and said, "We don't call that market the slave market anymore. when I have taken my grandchildren on tours, we usually hop on the trolley and we listen to the narratives. And the narratives now no longer refer to it as the slave market. I wanted to know what your opinion would be, and I'll give you mine. And I'm now speaking as obviously a white person. But I think what bothered me about that was the erasure of that history of what really happened at that slave market in St. Augustine.
Well, and I think that is the end goal of removing books from libraries, removing entire courses from like the AP African American course that was removed, books by Toni Morrison, books by queer and trans people. The goal is it's not just to make us forget, but is to rear an entire generation of people who literally don't have an idea that those things ever happened. And so they're playing for when I say they, you can just fill in the blanks. They're playing for the longer haul, the long game, just like at least I could see, and maybe some other professors could see back in 2003 or 2002, when they signed a No Child Left Behind legislation that subsequently for 12 years gutted public education in America and led to something like 1/3 of the nation's schools, public schools, were closed. They were playing for the long haul in the sense of, wasn't just that they want to close those schools, because the funding is minuscule to education compared to defense. The long haul, the long game, was to create an entire generation of people who literally don't have the ability to think scientifically or rationally. In other words, places where you, I, and Zander learned rules of grammar, rules of reason, learned how to have a conversation with someone using principles of logic and the principles of civil decorum, where you just bash them in the head if they disagree. We wanted to train an entire generation of people who literally don't have that equipment. And so it's easier now to sell any type of truth or any type of narrative to people who don't know the real narrative or don't know how to go find the truth. It's easier also to keep people oppressed when they're sick and also when they're uneducated. And so I feel like these book bannings also, so when I was saying a little earlier about my study of fascism and totalitarianism, I sort of referring to some session I had in graduate school with the Holocaust and reading lots of narratives and just trying to understand how something so atrocious could happen, particularly in the age of modernity, in the age of reason and rationality. And so the book bannings, to me, that also took place in Weimar Germany. Well, Weimar Germany fell in 1933, but one of the first things they began to do was remove the literature and to not only ban the books, but to burn them. And then they started with the laws, for example. I see a lot of parallels between laws that proscribed and forbade Jews from being able to just have a freaking business, for God's sakes, or being able to get social services. The same sort of things we picked out the scapegoat. This time it's a little bit bigger. It's trans people. I don't think we talk enough about anti-Semitism when we talk about racism in the country. But I think that today's boogeyman is trans people and Jewish people and migrants to a certain extent. I think this is ultimately for the long haul, to make it possible so that no one not only just doesn't even know how to get those narratives or know how to understand what really happened, but is to produce an entire generation of people who don't even know any of that stuff ever happened. And I'm not surprised. It's very saddening and to some extent maddening to hear about, even in just very public venues, that discourse is being blotted out. Those are my thoughts about it. It's a long game.
We are taking our second commercial break. We will be back shortly.
UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good. UK Health Radio, the station that makes you feel good.
We are back from our second commercial break. We'll have a short replay. We are meeting with Dr. Trystan Cotton.
saddening and to some extent maddening to hear about, even in just very public venues, that discourse is being blotted out. Those are my thoughts about it. It's a long game.
Yeah, it is very disturbing. And I think what is even more disturbing is that I'm well aware that years ago, and this was through a friend of mine who since then moved to Thailand, a gay man, and he found out that I had moved here for its beauty and just getting away. And so I decided this is where I want to live. I've always loved coming here. He's also an academic. We were talking. And he said, I've been threatened by a white supremacist group. And I said, what are you talking about? And so I ran a query looking up his name, and my name appeared in the same vein. They were anti-Semitists, and we joked about it. And I said, it's dangerous hanging out with you. And we were able to chuckle. But one of the things I wrote on my WordPress, I think it was my WordPress site, that I see, and that's because I grew up with my parents always reminding us that history will repeat itself because human beings just don't learn. They just don't. And perhaps to your assessment, this erasure prevents people from learning. So I have concerns about our governor. I think he's now gone beyond and above what he said he was doing. And I'm hearing from teachers, school teachers. And I'm also very concerned because I knew what the narratives were because I was part of that with my partner's child at the time when we were going through the school system. And there was a lot of pushback for any discussions, I'm talking high school level, for any discussions around identity or sexual orientation. And I now see him more or less so obvious, but I think a lot of us now are very worried about what we know happened pre-World War II. And it was all that cleaning up that took place before it got bad. But it's not just here.
Yeah, so I just say a couple of things about that. It is also the process of, I like the way you put it, this quote, cleaning up, this process of cleaning up or constantly sort of subjected to stop and frisk searches, having to go through security checkpoints and being racially profiled where I've had them pull me over aside and ask me to drop my pants, for example. So if you're racially profiled by police officers, you're stopped and frisked, it's possible that your trans identity could be found out in that frisking, in that searching, or if you're taken to jail. So there are additional factors that go into why trans men want to have genital surgery that kind of help us understand a little bit more why you see such a high percentage among white trans men. So those are the kinds of stories that both overlap with the way we think trans people live, but also in some ways diverge and sort of cut their own path of how they're going to live as a trans person. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And you're on that list.
Yeah. I was going to say, if I were to really sort of boil it down, what's the main reason why I had bottom surgery or genital reconstruction or phalloplasty? It was that safety piece. I wanted to be able to just go through the airport. I wanted to be able to just walk around and not have anything that was very visibly noticeable about me. It's
right.
And that's because I come from an experience of being very visible as a masculine woman, part of lesbian community, and that brought me so much attention, and a lot of it very negative attention, and I didn't want a repeat of that. So I know that that's a common story. Well, Theo, it's been a joy having you on the show. I'm so happy that we're necked in this way. We're in touch pretty regularly, but you're bouncing around, you're living all over, you're living in different parts of the world, you're traveling to different parts of the world. I'm really happy, for the work that you're getting to do. And I'm so happy about the success of Transgress Press. And did you want to take us out?
Thank you for joining our show, Dr. Cotton. Theo, it was great speaking with you, and we hope to have you back again. We've talked about even having a panel of people, and I think, I don't know about you, Zander, but I could see you participating and being a voice for many out there.
I agree.
And it's been a real pleasure. I love the conversations. We talked about a few things that really got down deep in there with a couple. And I do thank y'all. And thank y'all for doing this. Doing this podcast, I think, is important for the more people can hear our voices and our stories. It goes a long way for our survival.
Thank you, everyone, for joining the Umbrella Hour and showing up today. We also enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Cotton. Join us next time on the Umbrella Hour. Our next featured guest will be Dr. Courtney Ziegler. We hope you will join us soon. Our physical and mental well-being dominate headlines as the public seek reliable, quality news and information about health. We have over 500,000 UK listeners a month who are now engaging regularly with UK Health Radio.